So now I'm going to show it to you. Okay, so once more, good morning. Today I'm going to read the footnotes to Mysterium Encounter. And in order to help you appreciate how significant this is, I want to show you this is what I was reading yesterday, which is the actual text. And you can see there's 7 or 8 lines there, but underneath it, these are the footnotes. And some of these footnotes are very significant because they indicate how Dr. Jung himself edited his own work. He had originally written the contents of the Red Book in black books, which were his clinical records. He kept clinical records in black books, and so he was keeping a clinical record of himself. And then he transcribed significant portions of those black books into the Red Book. Now, one thing to understand here is that Dr. Sonu Shamdasani then had to make decisions about what to put in what is today the published version of the Red Book. And so his footnotes suggest things that had been left out of the main text. And I'm told that there are approximately 50% of the contents of the Red Book which have been omitted, but later this fall, or perhaps next spring, they're going to publish the black books, or at least one of the black books, or start to publish the black books. It's not very clear exactly what they're publishing, but those are going to help immensely in understanding Dr. Jung's thought process in the period between 1912 and 1928. So today what I'm going to do is I'm going to read the footnotes, and I will read the text, which I read yesterday, in context, but I won't read the entire text. I'll only read the text which relates to the specific footnote so that you can appreciate what he was saying. And so I'm starting on page 174 of the Reader's Edition of Liber Novus, the Red Book, and that corresponds to page 245 of the Folio Edition. So I'm going to begin these footnotes now. Text. On the night when I considered the essence of the God, I became aware of an image. I lay in a dark depth. An old man stood before me. He looked like one of the old prophets. Footnote 156. December 21st, 2013. In Black Book 2, Jung noted, quote, with a gray beard and wearing an oriental robe, unquote. And Shamdasani has page numbers here. I presume these page numbers are page numbers in the Black Book. I'm going to leave these out because I presume they are not going to correspond anyway to the published Black Books when they come out. Now, you must recall that Dr. Jung was the son of a Swiss Reformed pastor, so that's a Protestant pastor, and he had many uncles and so on, grandfathers that had been pastors before him, so he was the son of a long line of religious leaders, and so he was steeped in the Bible basically from the time he could talk, and unfortunately for him, he never took up the belief. He never got the belief. And he was the son of a pastor who had lost his faith. And so he went looking for what God was, because he appeared on the scene, or he started to do his work about 20 years after Friedrich Nietzsche had written Thus Spake Zarathustra, in which he announced that God is dead. And so much of Dr. Jung's career was in a search for God and what God is. And he found the living God. And that is the essence of his main work that applies to people outside of the clinical psychology, psychotherapy clinic. But finding that soul, that part of God within oneself, is a very complicated thing, and Dr. Jung wrote 20 volumes of the collected works about this topic. So in the Red Book, we're only talking about the very beginning of that process, but many of these references in the Red Book, they relate to Dr. Jung himself and not to you or to me, and therefore they are related to biblical images which were put into his psyche during his upbringing. And so the footnotes explain that a bit. Okay, so the next text is, I am Elijah. Footnote 157. Elijah was one of the prophets of the Old Testament. He first appears in 1 Kings 17, bearing a message from God to Ahab, the king of Israel. In 1953, the Carmelite pair Bruno wrote to Jung asking how one established the existence of an archetype. Jung replied by taking Elijah as an example, describing him as a highly mythical personage, which did not prevent him from probably being a historical figure. Drawing together descriptions of him throughout history, Jung described him as a living archetype who represented the collective unconscious and the self. He noted that such a constellated archetype gave rise to new forms of assimilation and represented a compensation on the part of the unconscious. Collected Work 18, paragraphs 1518 through 1531. So that sentence goes on. I am Elijah, and this is my daughter Salome. Footnote 158. Salome was the daughter of Herodias and the stepdaughter of King Herod. In Matthew 14 and Mark 6, John the Baptist had told King Herod that it was unlawful for him to be married to his brother's wife, and Herod put him in prison. Salome, who is not named but simply called the daughter of Herodias, danced before Herod on his birthday, and he promised to give her anything she wished for. She requested the head of John the Baptist, who was then beheaded. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the figure of Salome fascinated painters and writers, including Guillaume Apollinaire, Gustave Flaubert, Stéphanie Mallarmé, Gustave Moreau, Oscar Wilde, and Franz von Stuck, featuring in many works. See Bram Dijkstra, Idols of Perversity, Fantasies of Feminine Evil in fin de siècle Culture. New York, Oxford University Press, 1986, pages 379 to 398. From the text on page 176, I see how the black serpent rises up the tree and hides in the branches. Everything becomes gloomy and doubtful. Elijah rises. I follow, and we go silently back through the hall. Footnote 159. Black Book 2 continues. The crystal shines dimly. I think again in the image of Odysseus, how he passed the rocky island of the Sirens on his lengthy odyssey. Should I? Should I not? Page 174. Text. Salome loves me. Do I love her? I hear wild music, a tambourine, a sultry moonlight night, the bloody staring head of the Holy One. Footnote 160, i.e., the head of John the Baptist. Text. Woe, was she the hand of the god? I do not love her. I fear her. Then the spirit of the depths spoke to me and said, therein you acknowledge her divine power. Must I love Salome? Footnote 161. In the 1925 seminar, Jung recounted, I used the same technique of the descent, but this time I went much deeper. The first time, I should say, I reached a depth of about 1,000 feet, but this time it was a cosmic depth. It was like going to the moon, or like the feeling of a descent into empty space. First, the picture was of a crater, or a ring chain of mountains, and my feeling association was that of one dead, as if oneself were a victim. It was the mood of the land of the hereafter. I could see two people, an old man with a white beard and a young girl who was very beautiful. I assumed them to be real and listened to what they were saying. The old man said he was Elijah, and I was quite shocked, but she was even more upsetting because she was Salome. I said to myself that there was a queer mixture, Salome and Elijah, but Elijah assured me that he and Salome had been together since eternity. This also upset me. With them was a black serpent who had an affinity for me. I stuck to Elijah as being the most reasonable of the lot, for he seemed to have a mind. I was exceedingly doubtful about Salome. We had a long conversation, but I did not understand it. Of course, I thought of the fact of my father being a clergyman as being the explanation of my having figures like this. How about this old man, then? Salome was not to be touched upon. It was only much later that I found her association with Elijah quite natural. Whenever you take journeys like this, you find a young girl with an old man. Introduction to Jungian Psychology, pages 68 to 69. Jung then refers to examples of this pattern in the work of Melville, Meyrink, Rider Haggard, and the Gnostic legend of Simon Magus, Kundry and Klingsor from Wagner's Parsifal, and Francesco Colonna's Hypnerotomachia. In Memories, he noted, in myths, the snake is a frequent counterpart of the hero. There are numerous accounts of their affinity. Therefore, the presence of the snake was an indication of a hero myth. Of Salome, he said, Salome is an anima figure, blind because, though connecting the conscious and the unconscious, she does not see the operation of the unconscious. Elijah is the personification of the cognitional element, Salome of the erotic. Elijah is the figure of the old prophet filled with wisdom. One could speak of these two figures as personifications of Logos and Eros, very specifically shaped. This is practical for intellectual play, but as Logos and Eros are purely speculative terms, not scientific in any sense, but irrational, it is very much better to leave the figures as they are, namely as events, experiences. Introduction to Jungian Psychology, pages 96 and 97. In 1955-56, Jung wrote, "For purely psychological reasons, I have elsewhere attempted to equate the masculine consciousness with the concept of logos, and the feminine with that of eros. By logos, I meant discrimination, judgment, insight, and by eros, I meant the placing into relation." Mysterium Conjunctionis, collected work 14, paragraph 224. On Jung's reading of Elijah and Salome in terms of Logos and Eros, respectively, see Appendix B, Commentaries. That's the video that I read 2 days ago, so you can find it here in this channel. There's the number 2 in brackets in the text, and then footnote 162. The corrected draft has guiding reflection. The draft and corrected draft have, quote, "This, my friend, is a mystery play in which the spirit of the depths cast me. I had recognized the birth of the new God, the conception, and therefore the spirit of the depths allowed me to participate in the underworld ceremonies which were supposed to instruct me about the God's intentions and works. Through these rituals, I was supposed to be initiated into the mysteries of redemption." Then the text goes on. "This play that I witnessed is my play, not your play. It is my secret, not yours. You cannot imitate me. My secret remains virginal, and my mysteries are inviolable. They belong to me and cannot belong to you. You have your own." Footnote 163. The draft continues. "In the renewed world, you can have no outer possessions unless you create them out of yourselves. You can enter only into your own mysteries. The spirit of the depths has other things to teach you than me. I only have to bring you tidings of the new God and of the ceremonies and mysteries of his service. But this is the way. It is the gate to darkness." Text, But let your hope, which is your highest good and highest ability, lead the way and serve you as a guide in the world of darkness, since it is of like substance with the forms of that world." Footnote 164. The draft continues. "The mystery play took place at the deepest bottom of my interior, which is that other world. You have to bear this in mind. It is also a world, and its reality is large and frightening. You cry and laugh and tremble, and sometimes you break out in a cold sweat for fear of death. The mystery play represents myself, and through me, the world to which I belong is represented. Thus, my friends, you learn much about the world, and through it about myself. By what I say to you here. But you have not learned anything about your mysteries in this way. Indeed, your way is darker than before, since my example will stand obstructively in your path. You may follow me, not on my way, but on yours. Immediately after that footnote, there is the word image, and then the image is referring to this image. So let me give it back to you. This is footnote 165. And so this is the image that Dr. Jung himself painted to exemplify the scene in Mysterium Encounter. Okay. Okay, now I'm going to read a long sentence which actually has 4 footnotes in it. Text. The powers of my depths are predetermination and pleasure. Predetermination or forethinking is Prometheus, who, without determined thoughts, brings the chaotic to form and definition, who digs the channels and holds the object before pleasure. Footnote 166. This is a subjective interpretation of the figures of Elijah and Salome. And remember, always in Jungian psychology, the subjective refers to within you, the objective relates to something you are seeing outside of yourself. So, footnote 166, this is a subjective interpretation of the figures of Elijah and Salome. Footnote 167, in the corrected draft, predetermination or forethought is replaced by, quote, the idea, unquote. This substitution occurs throughout the rest of this section. Footnote 168. In Greek mythology, Prometheus created mankind out of clay. He could foretell the future, and his name signifies forethought. In 1921, Jung wrote an extended analysis of Carl Spitzler's epic poem, Prometheus and Epimetheus, 1881, together with Goethe's Prometheus Fragment, 1773. See Psychological Types, Collected Works 6, Chapter 5. Footnote 169. The corrected draft has boundary. Let me go back to that so that that's clearer. Predetermination or forethinking is Prometheus, who, without determined thoughts, brings the chaotic to form. And immediately after form is footnote 169. The corrected draft has boundary. So presumably we're saying form equals boundary. So let me see. Sean Steele says, I wonder how many of these realizations came from an interaction with his patients. I think quite a lot of them, of course. By this time, he had been practicing in the Bergholzli for 13 years, or he practiced there, I guess, for about 8 years, and then he had been out of there. but he had been practicing clinical psychology, so quite a lot may have come from his patients. But what we are in is Dr. Jung's own deep unconscious, and this entire book, the Red Book, is about his active imaginations in his own deep unconscious. So if you were to have an active imagination, it would be quite different from that, as mine was. I had an extended 8-month active imagination in 1993, which emerged as the novel Mako, Memoirs of a Woman, which I have later described as the autobiography of my anima from 1962 to 1993. Miles Flagg, and mind you, that's under my pen name, David Garrettson. Miles Flagg says, who do you think are the figures in the painting? The figures are Elijah and Salome as envisioned by Dr. Jung. So Sean says, I lack a lot of deep biblical knowledge, but it seems to require to see the full form picture. Gradually. I mean, I'm not a biblical scholar, so I've learned a lot about the Bible since I've been studying Dr. Jung. And Thomas says, Miles, Miles there, Elijah and Salome. Okay, going on. Text, forethinking needs pleasure to be able to come to form. Pleasure needs forethinking to come to form, which it requires. Footnote 170, the draft continues. Therefore, the forethinker approached me as Elijah, the prophet, and pleasure as Salome. Text, apart from Elijah and Salome, I found the serpent as a third principle. Footnote 171, the draft continues, the animal of deadly horror which lay between Adam and Eve. Text, if I feel from pleasure across to forethinking, likewise I feel first the cold, cruel serpent. Footnote 172, the corrected draft continues, the serpent is not only a separating but also a unifying principle. Text. The serpent is the earthly essence of man of which he is not conscious. Its character changes according to peoples and lands, since it is the mystery that flows to him from the nourishing Earth Mother. Footnote 173. When commenting on this in the 1925 seminar, Jung noted that there were many accounts in mythology of the relation between a hero and a serpent, so the presence of the serpent indicated that it will again be a hero myth. He showed a diagram of a cross with relational thinking, thinking, Elijah at the top, feeling, Salome at the bottom, irrational/intuition, superior at the left, and sensation, inferior, serpent at the right. He interpreted the black serpent as the introverting libido. Quote, the serpent leads the psychological movement apparently astray into the kingdom of shadows, dead and wrong images, but also into earth, into concretization. Inasmuch as the serpent leads into the shadows, it has the function of the anima. It leads you into the depths. It connects the above and the below. The serpent is also the symbol of wisdom. Introduction to Jungian Psychology. Okay, skipping ahead. I'm on page 181 of the Reader's Edition, if you're following along. Thus, the serpent is an adversary and a symbol of enmity, but also a wise bridge that connects right and left through longing much needed by our life. Footnote 174. The draft continues. By following Elijah and Salome, I follow the two principles inside me and through me in the world of which I am a part. Text. The dark space is the space of forethinking. It is dark, so he who lives there requires vision. Footnote 175. The corrected draft continues, that is, of thinking, and without thinking one cannot grasp an idea. I'm now on page 182 of the Reader's Edition. I'm sorry, this is text carries over from 181. Eve and the serpent show me that my next step leads to pleasure, and from there again on lengthy wanderings like Odysseus. He went astray when he played his trick at Troy. Footnote 176. The draft continues. What would Odysseus have been without his wandering? The corrected draft adds, there would have been no Odyssey. The bright garden is the space of pleasure. He who lives there needs no vision. Footnote 177. The corrected draft continues, then much rather the pleasure to enjoy the garden. He who lives there needs no vision. He feels the unending. Footnote 178. The corrected draft continues. It is strange that Salome's garden lies so close to the dignified and mysterious hall of ideas. Does a thinker therefore experience awe or perhaps even fear of the idea because of its proximity to paradise? So we can see by how this is going that Dr. Sonu Shamdasani made some very significant editorial decisions in doing the Red Book, because he left a lot of these commentary points that were in the corrected draft of the Black Books. He left them out of the published Red Book, but he put them in these footnotes. So the Red Book reads along very well and is a great tribute to Dr. Shamdasani, but Dr. Jung was also, as a psychologist and psychiatrist, trying to work out what these things meant as he went along. Let's see. Text, but forethought leads to Salome. And then the beginning of the next paragraph reads, at the beginning of it is footnote 179, but I'm going to read the first sentence. But I was a thinker and caught sight of the hostile principle of pleasure from forethinking. It appeared to me as Salome. Paragraph 179. The draft continues. I was a forethinker. What could astonish me more than the intimate community of forethinking and pleasure, these inimical principles? Text. The thinker's passions are bad, therefore he has no pleasure. The thoughts of one who feels are bad, therefore he has no thoughts. Footnote 180. The corrected draft has instead one who has pleasure. So that is referring to the thoughts of one who feels. And in the corrected draft, in the footnote, it says one who has pleasure. Text, he who prefers to think than to feel, footnote 181, pleasure, leaves his feeling, footnote 182, pleasure. Okay, so in these two sentences, he's referring to feeling and pleasure as the same thing. All right, so let me read the text sentences again. The thinker's passions are bad, therefore he has no pleasure. The thoughts of one who feels are bad, therefore he has no thoughts. He who prefers to think than to feel leaves his feeling to rot in darkness. Okay. So, Miles said, who is reclining? Thomas says, Elijah is known as Kidder, the Green One, in Islamic mythology, by the way. Thomas, I wonder who is reclining also. The eye of the text, perhaps. Yes, I certainly think that's the reclining figure on the left side in the white thobe. Sean, I just got that, Thomas. Miles, maybe the I as in Jung or you or me, and or Jesus as the God image in each of us. How can I answer that? Jesus as the God image. Yeah, perhaps. I mean, obviously it's the self that is observing this scene. Thomas says the split between feeling and thinking is interesting here, described as a writhing serpent. Absolutely. Okay, going on. I'm on page 183. You begin to have a presentiment of the whole when you embrace your opposite principle, since the whole belongs to both principles, which grow from one root. Footnote 183. The draft continues. As one of your poets has said, the shaft bears two irons. Okay. Text. May the thinking person accept his pleasure, and the feeling person accept his own thought. Such leads one along the way. Footnote 184. In 1913, Jung presented his paper on the question of psychological types, in which he noted that the libido, or psychic energy, in an individual was characteristically directed toward the object, extroversion, or toward the subject, introversion. Collected Works 6, which is Psychological Types. Commencing in the summer of 1915, he had extensive correspondence with Hans Schmidt on this question, in which he now characterized the introverts as being dominated by the function of thinking, and the extroverts as being dominated by the function of feeling. He also characterized the extroverts as being dominated by the pleasure-pain mechanism, seeking out the love of the object, and unconsciously seeking tyrannical power. Introverts unconsciously sought inferior pleasure and had to see that the object was also a symbol of their pleasure. On August 7th, 1915, he wrote to Schmidt, "The opposite should be evened out in the individual himself." This is from The Question of Psychological Types, which is forthcoming according to Shamdasani. This linkage between thinking and introversion, or feeling and extroversion, was maintained in his discussion of this subject in 1917 in The Psychology of the Unconscious Processes. In Psychological Types, 1921, this model had expanded to encompass two main attitude types of introverts and extroverts, further subdivided by the predominance of one of the four psychological functions of thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition. So this is a reference to the Myers-Briggs type indicator, and what Dr. Shamdasani seems to be saying is that imagistically the snake writhes back and forth between these main types in the MBTI, that is, thinking and feeling, sensation and intuition. And so what I would say is that, for example, in the U.S. military, military officers that rise tend to be sensation types. And I was very unlike that as a military officer because I'm so intuitive, but whenever I put my uniform on, I could assume the sensation type. In other words, the person that gets all the little details, and the intuitive person is the one that sees the big picture. And so even if you happen to be an intuitive, it's possible to put on the sensation type in consciousness, which is what I did. Whenever I put my uniform on, I became a sensation type, meaning that I looked for all the little details. Right, okay. So, moving ahead, I'm on page 184 now. On the following night, footnote 185, December 22, 1913. On December 19, 1913, Jung gave a talk on the psychology of the unconscious to the Zurich Psychoanalytic Society. So that full sentence reads, "On the following night, I was led to a second image. I am standing in the rocky depth that seems to me like a crater." Okay, and at the bottom of now page 184, there's a long sentence here, but the footnote relates to a phrase which is a many-armed bloody goddess, footnote 186, which he says the draft continues, quote, Kali, unquote. Kali is a Hindu goddess. Now I'll read the entire sentence. Peter stands in front of her in admiration. Then Peter alone with the key, the Pope with a triple crown, a Buddha sitting rigidly in a circle of fire, a many-armed bloody goddess. It is Salome desperately wringing her hands. It takes hold of me. It takes hold of me. She is my own soul, and now I see Elijah in the image of the stone. Okay, so that's the entire sentence. And in that sentence, where it says, it is Salome desperately wringing her hands, Footnote 187. Black Book 2 continues. Now that white shape of a girl with black hair, my own soul, and now that white shape of a man who also appeared to me at the time. It resembles Michelangelo's sitting Moses. It is Elijah. Michelangelo's Moses is in the Church of San Pietro in Vincoli in Rome. It was the subject of a study by Freud that was published in 1914, the standard edition of the complete psychological works of Sigmund Freud, edited by James Strachey in collaboration with Anna Freud, assisted by Alex Strachey and Alan Tyson Jr. Strachey, 24 volumes. London, the Hogarth Press and Institute of Psychoanalysis, 1953 to 1974, volume 13. The third-person pronoun it identifies Salome with Kale, whose many hands ring each other. Okay, so that's that footnote. On page 186, the text reads, "But your thoughts are just as much outside yourself as trees and animals are outside your body." Footnote 188. Jung mentioned this conversation in the 1925 seminar and commented, "Only then I learned psychological objectivity. Only then could I say to a patient, 'Be quiet, something is happening.' There are such things as mice in the house. You cannot say you are wrong when you have a thought. For the understanding of the unconscious, we must see our thoughts as events, as phenomena." From Introduction to Jungian Psychology, page 103. Text. "I stepped into your house, my father, with the fear of a schoolboy, but you taught me salutary wisdom." Footnote 189. The corrected draft has instead truth. I'm at the bottom of page 187. There's a footnote 190 at the beginning of a paragraph that has this sentence: It is no small matter to acknowledge one's yearning. For this many need to make a particular effort at honesty. So immediately before that text is footnote 190. The corrected draft has guiding reflection. In the draft and corrected draft, a lengthy passage occurs. What follows here is a paraphrase. : "I wonder whether this is real, an underworld, or the other reality, and whether it was the other reality that had forced me here. I see here that Salome, my pleasure, moves to the left, the side of the impure and bad. This movement follows the serpent, which represents the resistance and the enmity against this movement. Pleasure goes away from the door. Forethinking, corrected draft, the idea, throughout this passage, stands at the door, knowing the entrance to the mysteries. Therefore desire melts into the many. If forethinking does not direct it and force it toward its goal, if forethinking does not direct it and force it toward its goal. If one meets a man who only desires, then one will find resistance against his desire behind it. Desire without forethinking gains much, but keeps nothing. Therefore, his desire is the source of constant disappointment. Thus, Elijah calls Salome back. If pleasure is united with forethinking, the serpent lies before them. To succeed in something, you first need to deal with the resistance and difficulty. Otherwise, joy leaves behind pain and disappointment. Therefore, I drew nearer. I had first to overcome the difficulty and the resistance to gain what I desired. When desire overcomes the difficulty, it becomes seeing and follows forethinking. Therefore, I see that Salome's hands are pure, with no trace of crime. My desire is pure if I first overcome the difficulty and resistance. If I weigh up pleasure and forethinking, I am like a fool blindly following his longing. If I follow my forethinking, I forsake my pleasure. The ancients said in images that the fool finds the right way. Forethinking has the first word. Therefore, Elijah asked me what I wanted. You should always ask yourself what you desire, since all too many do not know what they want. I did not know what I wanted. You should confess your longing and what you long for to yourself. Thus you satisfy your pleasure and nourish your forethinking at the same time. Okay, I hope this is helpful. Let's see. We've gone quite far in the chat here, so let me go back. Thomas says, in Kundalini Yoga's symbology, the snake rises as it rise from the lower chakras, starting at the base of the spine, called the Sushumna, in this system, upwards toward higher chakras, centers. Sean Steele says, I like that visual. Miles says, the spectrum in us might range from a bonobos ape to Mr. Spock. That's pretty funny. Sean laughed also. Sean, dude, that's like a psychedelic experience. Thomas, Salome would have some commonalities with Kali. Severed heads, symbolically the head thinking function cut off from the body. Sean, I've had dreams like that where I felt intense fear, then relief instantly after I entered a whole new world. After the serial killer is chasing you, after the serial killer is chasing you, dream, but then you see some significant phenomena you never noticed, but was always there in your dream. Miles, listening to Skip reading Jung makes my mind spiral. Okay, yeah. Mine too, but I presume you're finding these footnotes of use. Okay, so I am on page 189. Text, the image of the Mother of God with the child that I foresee indicates to me the mystery of the transformation. Footnote 191. The corrected draft has, in his outer appearance, in the misery of earthly reality. Okay. Text, I do not myself become the supreme meaning. Footnote 192. The corrected draft has instead the Son of God. And so let me read that entire sentence. I do not myself become the supreme meaning or the symbol, but the symbol becomes in me such that it has its substance, and I mine. Okay. Text, the binding and loosing take place in me. Footnote 193, Matthew 18:18. Christ says, quote, Whatsoever ye shall bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatsoever ye shall loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." Unquote. Text. You see how incredible it was to believe such of oneself. Footnote 194. The draft and corrected draft continue. The Pope in Rome has become an image and symbol for us of how God becomes human and how he, God, becomes the visible Lord of men. Thus the coming God will become the Lord of the world. This happens first here in me. The supreme meaning becomes my Lord and infallible commander, though not only in me, but perhaps in many others whom I don't know. Okay. Okay, I'm on page 190. It will fortify its reign and change itself into a fixed and riddling image whose meaning turns completely inward and whose pleasure radiates outward like blazing fire, a Buddha in the flames. Okay, so he's referring to whose pleasure radiates outward like a blazing fire. Footnote 195, corrected draft has, thus I become like the Buddha sitting in the flames. And the text says, a Buddha in the flames. And then footnote 196, the draft continues, where the idea is, pleasure always is too. If the idea is inside, pleasure is outside. Therefore, an air of evil pleasure envelops me. A lecherous and bloodthirsty Godhead gives me this false air. This happens because I must altogether suffer the becoming of the God, and can therefore not separate it from myself at first. But as long as it is not separated from me, I am so seized by the idea that I am it, and therefore I am also the woman associated with the idea from the beginning. In that I receive the idea and represent it in the manner of Buddha. My pleasure is like the Indian Kali, since she is Buddha's other side. Kali, however, is Salome, and Salome is my soul. Okay, then this paragraph ends with these words, I have interpreted these images as best I can with poor words. And then there's a footnote, 197, which begins, the paragraph begins with this sentence. In the moment of your bewilderment, follow your forethinking and not your blind desire, since forethinking leads you to the difficulties that should always come first. So footnote 197. In the draft, a lengthy passage occurs here, a paraphrase of which follows, quote, or colon, a paraphrase of which follows, colon, the numbness is like a death. I needed total transformation. Through this, my meaning, like that of the Buddha, went completely inside. Then the transformation happened. I then went over to pleasure as I was a thinker. As a thinker, I rejected my feeling, but I had rejected part of my life. Then my feeling became a poisonous plant, and when it awakened, it was sensuality instead of pleasure, the lowest and commonest form of pleasure. This is represented by Kali. Salome is the image of his pleasure. that suffers pain since it was shut out for too long, it then became apparent that Salome, i.e., my pleasure, was my soul. When I recognized this, my thinking changed and ascended to the idea, and then the image of Elijah appeared. This prepared me for the mystery play and showed me in advance the way of transformation that I had to undergo in the Mysterium. The flowing together of the forethinking with pleasure produces the God. I recognized that the God in me wanted to become a man, and I considered this and honored this, and I became the servant of the God. But for no one other than myself. Corrected draft, it would be madness and presumption to assume that I also did this for others. I sank into the contemplation of the wonder of transformation and first turned into the lower level of my pleasure, and then through this I recognized my soul. The smiles of Elijah and Salome indicate that they were happy at my appearance, but I was in deep darkness. When the way is dark, so is the idea that gives light. When the idea in the moment of confusion allows the words and not the blind longing, then the words lead you to difficulty, whereas it leads you to the right. That is why Elijah turns left to the side of the unholy and evil, and Salome turns right to the side of correct and good. She doesn't go to the garden, the place of pleasure, but remains in the house of the Father. Okay. Okay, I'm on page 191. Text, my forethinking rests on the lion, my power. Footnote, in the draft, a passage occurs, a paraphrase of which follows. If I am strong, so also are my intentions and presuppositions. My own thought weakens and goes over into the idea. The idea becomes strong. It is supported by its own strength. I recognize this in the fact that Elijah is supported by the lions. The lion is of stone. My pleasure is dead and turned to stone because I did not love Salome. This gave my thought the coldness of stone, and from this the idea took its solidity, which it needed to subjugate my thought. It needed to be subjugated as it strove against Salome, since she appeared bad to it. Okay. Page 192. My thoughts are not myself, but exactly like the things of the world, alive and dead. Footnote, in 1921, Jung wrote, the peculiar reality of unconscious contents, therefore, gives the same right to describe them as objects as outer things. From Psychological Types, Collected Works 6, paragraph 280. Text. Thoughts are natural events that you do not possess and whose meaning you only imperfectly recognize. Footnote 200. The draft and corrected draft have, I would have to consider myself mad. It would be more than inconsistent if I thought that I had produced the thoughts of the Mysterium. Let me read that again as a sentence. I would have to consider myself mad if I thought I had produced the thoughts of the Mysterium. Text. This will always drive us crazy, and we transform the vision into foolishness and monkey business, since we cannot desist from imitation. Footnote 201. The draft continues. I recognized the father because I was a thinker, and thus I did not know the mother, but saw love in the guise of pleasure and called it pleasure, and therefore this was Salome to me. Now I learn that Mary is the mother, the innocent love receiving and not pleasure, who bears the seed of evil in her heated and seductive nature. If Salome, evil pleasure, is my sister, then I must be thinking. Then I must be a thinking saint, and my intellect has met with a sad fate. I must sacrifice my intellect and confess to you that what I told you about pleasure, namely that it is the principle opposed to forethought, is incomplete and prejudiced. I observed as a thinker from the vantage point of my thinking. Otherwise, I could have recognized that Salome, as Elijah's daughter, is an offspring of thought and not the principle itself, which Mary, the innocent Virgin Mother, now appears as. Okay, I guess I have to observe that in the fullness of time now, 100 years later, there has been lots of research into these types, and the Myers-Briggs type indicator has been administered to many millions of people, and so we know that in these types, the first three scales came from Jung himself, introvert and extrovert, sensing and intuitive, and thinking and feeling. Those came from Jung himself, and judging and perceiving, the last scale, came from the developers of the Myers-Briggs. But in any case, or at least so I believe, I don't recall actually that history, but in any case, these are scales within your psyche, and so you can fall anywhere on those scales. And so everyone is different. And so when Dr. Jung is talking about himself, he's talking about where he was falling in that scale. And so each one of us falls in different places. So as I've mentioned, I fall very far out on the intuitive end, the 99th percentile, but I'm closer to the center on thinking and feeling. I am a thinker, but I'm more a middle level thinker, and I also am quite introverted. So on Dr. Jung's scales, that's where I fit, so that you can appreciate maybe my work from that. Let's see what people say here. Okay, Catalan says, what do you think that he means by forethinking? I think he's referring to thinking. And Reptilonius, I came here late. When did it start? Started at 9 o'clock. Sean, save that line about darkness to light. Reptilonius, the light is brighter when you've been in the dark for long. Our world is one huge metaphor. Sean, in my experience, you can have these dreams too if you ask your mind before you go to sleep to take you into the unknown. I like to ask myself right before I fall asleep to have an adventure. Carl Jung was, and Reptilonius says, Carl Jung was always looking for his other half, for individuation is in divide duality. The concept of duality is the supposing paradox, which don't negate but exist in phase and resonant with each other. Reptilonius, the concept of duality as a class is the first scale of measure of first relationship. And Thomas says, intuitive introvert here. I'm not surprised. I probably could have figured that one out without even ever speaking to you, Thomas. Anyway, going on. I hope I can get through this. Okay, I'm on page 193. If you crush the covering of shame, and when the two become one, and the male with the female, neither male nor female. Footnote 202. The Gospel of the Egyptians is one of the apocryphal Gospels that features a dialogue between Christ and Salome. Christ states that he has come to undo the work of the female, namely lust, birth, and decay. To Salome's question of how long shall death prevail, Christ answered, as long as women bear children. Here, Jung is referring to the following passage. She said, quote, then I have done well in not giving birth, unquote, imagining that it is not permitted to bear children. The Lord answered, eat of every herb, but the bitter one eat not. The dialogue continues. When Salome asked when it shall be made known, the Lord said, when you tread underfoot the covering of shame, and when out of two is made one, and the male with the female, neither male nor female. That's from the apocryphal New Testament, edited by J.K. Elliott, Oxford University Press, 1999, page 18. Jung cites this logion available to him from Clement of the Stromatius as an example of the union of opposites in Visions, Volume 1, page 524, and as an example of the conjunctio of male and female On the Psychology of the Child Archetype, Collected Work 19, paragraph 295, and Mysterium Conjunctionis, Collected Work 14, paragraph 528. Okay, so the point is, even though there's a book about the MBTI out called People Types and Tiger Stripes, and so whatever your type, don't take that as gospel about what the way you have to be all the time, because different circumstances call for different type reactions. So as I described, when I put on my Marine Corps uniform, I become a sensing thinker and judging, and I'm not a judging person normally. So I become sensing, thinking, judging, which is sort of the stereotype of the Marine Corps officer. But those are not my natural type, but I can put it on with my uniform and be that as a persona. Reptilionus says, knowledge of good and evil is essentially the concept of duality, for man before that viewed the world in totality. The formless void is the concept less void, form as in Platonic realism, idealism. Thomas says, Enneagram people really get into typing. Okay, so anyway, I'm not an Enneagram person, but I do think that it's helpful to understand the psychological types. And the U.S. military, by the way, teaches the MBTI in every senior school that I ever attended, including the Naval War College, the National War College, the Industrial College of the Armed Forces, Command and Staff College. All of them taught the MBTI. And the reason is that for any mission, You need the sensing people to get all the facts. You need the intuitive people to understand what the facts mean. You need the thinking people to think through the plan. And you need the feeling people to understand what execution of the plan will mean to society later on. Those are all very important. Okay, going on. Forethinking text. Forethinking is the procreative, love is the receptive. Footnote 203. The draft and corrected draft have. But when the mystery play showed me this, I didn't understand, but I thought I had produced an incredible thought. I am mad to believe this, and I believed it. Therefore, I was seized by fear, and I wanted to explain my arbitrary thoughts to Elijah and Salome, and thus invalidate them. Okay. Text. I won the power back again from the depths, and it went before me like a lion. Footnote 204. The draft continues. The image of the cool starry night and of the vast sky opens up my eye to the infinity of the inner world, which I, as a desirous man, feel is still too cold. I cannot pull the stars down to myself, but only watch them. Therefore, my impetuous desire feels that that world is nightly and cold. Okay, so we're in the section called Resolution now, page 194 of the Reader's Edition. And so there's a reference to the image again, and that is footnote 205. This depicts a scene in the fantasy that follows. Okay, I'm not clear about that. I looked that up in the Folio Edition, and I did not see an image other than the image that we're already seeing on the screen here. So footnote 206, this is December 25th, 1913, almost exactly 7 months before the beginning of World War I. And just to nail this a little bit, he gave the date, and then it begins, on the third night, deep longing to continue experiencing the mysteries seized me. The struggle between doubt and desire was great in me, but suddenly I saw that I stood before a steep ridge in a wasteland. It is a dazzling bright day. I catch sight of the prophet high above me. Okay, so I'll leave that text. That I read that yesterday. Okay. Text, both serpents. Okay, so there's been a battle in this resolution. There's been a battle between a white serpent and a black serpent, and the black serpent ultimately withdraws from the battle and has turned half white, and so the text says, I see the black serpent pulls itself back again. The front part of its body has become white. Both serpents curl about themselves, one in light, the other in darkness. Footnote 207. In the 1925 seminar, Jung said, a few evenings later, I felt that things should continue, so again I tried to follow the same procedure, but it would not descend. I remained on the surface. Then I realized that I had a conflict in myself about going down, but I could not make out what it was. I only felt that the two dark principles were fighting each other, two serpents. Introduction to Jungian Psychology, page 104. He then recounted the fantasy that ensued. Okay, so there's the fantasy between him and Elijah. Text. Elijah comes before me into the heights to a very high summit. I follow. On the peak we come to some masonry made of huge blocks. It is a round embankment on the summit. Footnote 208. In the 1925 seminar, Jung added, I thought, ha, this is a druidic sacred place. Text. I am mime, and I will show you the well springs. Footnote 209. In Wagner's Ring of the Nibelung dwarf Mime is the brother of Alberich and a master craftsman. Alberich stole the Rheingold from the Rhine maidens through renouncing love. He was able to forge a ring out of it that conferred limitless power. In Siegfried, Mime, who lives in a cave, brings up Siegfried so that he will kill Fafnir the giant, who has transformed into a dragon and now has the ring. Siegfried slays Fafnir with the invincible sword that Mime has fashioned, and kills Mime, who had intended to kill him after he recovered the ring. And so I made the comment yesterday during this reading that in some ways this sounds like Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. And there is an excellent talk, which I think Thomas did refer me to earlier, by Becca Tarnas, and it's on YouTube. It's about a 2-hour-long talk, but it's well worth your time, in which Becca does a comparison between the Red Book of C.G. Jung and the Red Book of J.R.R. Tolkien. So I urge you to take a look at that. So Reptilonus says, I was INTP that moved to ENFP. I wonder what I am now. Haven't tested in a while as I've grown. Thomas, they have 9 types in a test to determine your type. It's not dissimilar to MBTI. I think he's referring to another test. I'd hate to understand anyone too quickly. Sean says, awesome imagery. Reptilineus, looking into CEST, Thomas. It's essentially Carl Jung thinking, feeling. Thomas, the black and white serpents can't be helped but bring up the image of caduceus, which has become the symbol of the healing profession. Absolutely, that's exactly where it does come from. And Sean says the DNA helix one. And Isaiah, with regard to your changing type, I think that's why Skip said that it's not to be taken as gospel. I've tested extroverted feeling all my life, but can also think and sense. And Reptilineus, the black would be thinking, because forethought is emptiness and hollow, waiting to be filled in love. Intuitive emotional is a full and overflowing vessel waiting to give. Okay, fair enough. Okay, so we've read that. Okay, on page 196 now. The walls enlarge into a huge mountain, and I see that I am below on the foundation of the crater in the underworld, and I stand before the house of the prophet. Footnote 210. In the 1925 seminar, Jung interpreted this episode as follows. The fight of the two snakes. The white means a movement into the day, the black into the kingdom of darkness with moral aspects. 2. There was a real conflict in me, a resistance to going down. My stronger tendency was to go up, because I had been so impressed the day before with the cruelty of the place I had seen. I really had a tendency to find a way to the conscious by going up, as I did on the mountain. Elijah said that it was just the same below or above. Compare Dante's Inferno. The Gnostics expressed the same idea in the symbol of the reversed cones. Thus the mountain and the crater are similar. There is nothing of conscious structure in these fantasies. They were just events that happened. So I assume that Dante got his ideas from the same archetypes. Introduction to Jungian Psychology, pages 104 to 105. McGuire suggests that Jung is referring to Dante's conception of the conical form of the cavity of hell with its circles, mirroring in reverse the form of heaven with its spheres. In Ion, Jung also noted that serpents were a typical pair of opposites, and that the conflict between serpents was a motif found in medieval alchemy. And that the conflict between serpents was a motif found in medieval alchemy. Collected work 9.2, paragraph 181. Page 197. Text. Salome, you are Christ. I stand with outstretched arms like someone crucified, my body taut and horribly entwined by the serpent. You, Salome, say that I am Christ? Footnote 211. In the 1925 seminar, Jung recounted that after Salome's declaration that he was Christ, quote, in spite of my objection, she maintained this. I said, this is madness, and I became filled with skeptical resistance. Introduction to Jungian Psychology. He interpreted this event as follows, quote, Salome's approach in her worshipping of me is obviously that side of the inferior function, which is surrounded by an aura of evil. One is assailed by the fear that perhaps this is madness. This is how madness begins. This is madness. You cannot get conscious of these unconscious facts without giving yourself to them. If you can overcome your fear of the unconscious and can let yourself go down, then these facts take on a life of their own. You can be gripped by these ideas so much that you really go mad, or nearly so. These images have so much reality that they recommend themselves and such extraordinary meaning that one is caught. They form part of the ancient mysteries. In fact, it is such fantasies that made the mysteries. Compare the mysteries of Isis as told in Annapolis with the initiation and deification of the initiate. One gets a peculiar feeling from being put through an initiation. The important part that led up to the deification was the snake's encoiling of me. Salome's performance was deification. The animal face, which I felt mine transformed into, was the famous Deus, Leontocephalus, of the Mithraic mysteries, the figure which is represented with a snake coiled around the man, the snake's head resting on the man's head, and the face of the man that of a lion. In this deification mystery, you make yourself into the vessel and are a vessel of creation in which the opposites reconcile. He added, all this is Mithraic symbolism from beginning to end. In the Golden Ass, Lucian undergoes an initiation into the mysteries of Isis. The significance of this episode is that it is only direct description of such an initiation that has survived. Of the event itself, Lucian states, quote, I approached the very gates of death and set foot on Prosperine's threshold, yet was permitted to return, wrapped through all the elements. At midnight I saw the sun shining as if it were noon. I entered the presence of the gods of the underworld, and the gods of the upper world stood near and worshipped them. After this, he was presented on a pulpit in the temple in front of a crowd. He wore garments which included designs of serpents and winged lions, held a torch, and wore, quote, a palm tree chaplet with its leaves sticking all out like rays of light. From The Golden Ass, translated by R. Graves, Hammondsworth Penguin, 1984, page 241. Jung's copy of the German translation of this work has a line in the margin by this passage. I'm on page 198 now. My feet do not touch the ground of this earth, and it is as if I were melting into air. Footnote 212. On the Psychology of the Quarry Figure, 1951, Jung described these episodes as follows. In an underground house, actually in the underworld, there lives an old magician and prophet with his daughter. She is, however, not really his daughter. She is a dancer, a very loose person, but is blind and seeks healing. This description of Elijah draws him together with the later description of Philemon. Jung noted that this shows the unknown woman is a mythological figure in the beyond, that means in the unconscious. She is Soror, or Soror is Latin for sister. She is Soror or Filia Mystica, and that would be mystical sister, I believe. So she is Soror or Filia Mystica of a hierophant or philosopher, evidently a parallel to those mystic syzygies which are to be met with in the figures of Simon Magus and Helen, Zosimos and Theosebia, Comarius and Cleopatra, etc. Our dream figure fits in best with Helen. Okay, there are 3 footnotes close together here. My longing led me up to the overbright day, whose light is the opposite of the dark space of forethinking. And there are 3 footnotes in that. The first one is, the corrected draft has guiding reflections. In Black Book 2, Jung copied the following citations from Dante's Commedia in German translation, and I to him, quote, I am one who, when love breathes on me, notices in the manner that he dictates within. I utter words. Purgatorio 24, 52-54. And then in the same manner as a flame which follows the fire, whatever shape it takes, the new form follows the spirit exactly. Purgatorio 25, 97-99. And then my longing, footnote 214, the draft has the news of the desire revived by the mother. So that's, my longing is defined as the news of the desire revived by the mother. And opposite to the dark space of forethinking is the corrected draft has of the primordial image. And again, on page 195, or 199, text, the darkness that surrounds forethinking, footnote, the corrected draft has the idea or the primordial image. Appears to be due to the fact that it is invisible in the interior and takes place in the depth. Footnote 217, the corrected draft has lives in the depths. Okay. Text. I recognize in the struggle a repetition of that vision where I saw the struggle between the sun and the black serpent. Footnote 218. Descent into hell in the future. Text. This was the great war, but the spirit of the depths wants the struggle to be understood as a conflict in every man's own nature. So, following, but the spirit of the depths, footnote 219, the corrected draft has the spirit. And a conflict in every man's own nature, footnote 220. The draft continues, therefore they all say that they are fighting for the good and for peace, but one cannot fight one another over the good. But since men don't know that the conflict lies within themselves, the Germans thus believe that the English and the Russians are wrong, but the English and the Russians say that the Germans are wrong. But no one can judge history in terms of right and wrong, because one half of mankind is wrong, every man is half wrong. Therefore, a conflict resides in his own soul, but man is blind and always knows only his half. The German has in him the English, and the Russian, whom he fights outside of himself. Likewise, the English and the Russian has in him the German whom he fights. But man appears to see the outer quarrel, not the one within, which alone is the wellspring of the great war. But before man can ascend to light and love, the great battle is needed. That's where all the blood was in the two world wars, certainly. Let's see, I'm going to keep going because I've been going for an hour and 14 minutes. I have a few more pages to go, so I'm not going to look back at comments until the end. Text. Since after the death of the hero, our urge to live could no longer imitate anything, it therefore went into the depths of every man and excited the terrible conflict between the powers of the depths. Footnote 221. In December 1919, in his preface to The Psychology of the Unconscious Processes, Jung wrote, quote, "The psychological processes which accompany the present war, above all the incredible brutalization of public opinion, the mutual slanderings, the unprecedented fury of destruction, the monstrous flood of lies, and man's incapacity to call a halt to the bloody demon, are suited like nothing else to powerfully push in front of the eyes of thinking men the problems of the restlessly slumbering, chaotic unconscious under the ordered world of consciousness. This war has pitilessly revealed to civilized man that he is still a barbarian." but the psychology of the individual corresponds to the psychology of the nation. What the nation does is done also by each individual, and so long as the individual does it, the nation also does it. Only the change in the attitude of the individual is the beginning of the change in the psychology of the nation. Collected Works 7, paragraph 4. Have any relevance to us today? Yeah. Okay. Text. Therefore, my forethinking in the principle of the Heavenly Mother becomes an ugly dwarf who lives in a dark cave, like an unborn in the womb. Footnote 222, the corrected draft, the prophet, the personification of the idea. But forethinking, footnote 223, idea. Corrected draft has idea in place of forethinking. And then text, if you go to thinking, take your heart with you. Footnote 224, the corrected draft has idea substituted throughout this paragraph. So the idea, it would read, I guess, if you go to the idea, take your heart with you. On page 201, there's a sentence that or a couple of sentences that cover 3 footnotes. Man doesn't only grow from within himself, for he is also creative from within himself. The God becomes revealed in him. Human nature is little skilled in divinity, and therefore man fluctuates between too much and too little. Footnote 225, the corrected draft adds conscious and deletes from within himself. Footnote 226, the draft and corrected draft have instead, the divine creative power becomes in him a person, a personal consciousness from the unconscious collective. Footnote 227, the draft and corrected draft have, but why, you ask, does forethinking, the idea, appear to you in the guise of a Jewish prophet, and the pleasure in the guise of the heathen Salome? My friend, do not forget that I too am one who thinks and wants in the spirit of this time, and is completely under the spell of the serpent. I am just now, through my initiation into the mysteries of the spirit of the depths, about to not entirely discard all the ancientness lacked by those thinking in the spirit of this time, but to readopt it into my being human, to make my life whole. For I have become poor and far removed from God. I must take in the divine and the mundane, since the spirit of this time had nothing else to give me. On the contrary, he took the little that I possessed of real life. On the contrary, he took the little that I possessed of real life, but in particular he made me hasty and greedy, since he is merely the present, and he forced me to hunt down everything present to fill the moment. I'm on page 202 of the Reader's Edition. Text, but the depths do not hesitate any longer and will force you into the mysteries of Christ. Footnote 228, the draft and corrected draft have, just as the old prophets, ancients, stood before the mysterium of Christ, I also stand as yet before this mysterium of Christ, insofar as I reassume the past, although I lived 2,000 years after him later, and at one time I believed I was a Christian, but I had never been a Christ. Text, if you had not, then the evil of this world would be small. Okay, I better read the beginning of that paragraph. Should I therefore not want anything more? You wanted this war. That is good. If you had not, even the evil of this war would be small. But with your wanting, you make the evil great. Footnote 229, in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche wrote, to redeem the past and to transform every, quote, it was, unquote, into an, quote, I wanted thus, unquote. That alone do I call redemption. I'll read that once more. Footnote 229, and Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche wrote, to redeem the past and to transform every it was into an I wanted it thus, that alone do I call redemption. Text, if you do not succeed in producing the greatest evil out of this war, you will never learn the violent deed and learn to overcome fighting that lies outside you. Footnote 230. On February 11, 1916, Jung said in a discussion at the Association for Analytical Psychology, quote, we abuse the will. Natural growth is subjected to the will. War teaches us the will is of no use. We will see where this leads. We are completely subject to the absolute power of the becoming, unquote. Text, therefore it is good if you want this greatest evil with your whole heart. Footnote 231, the draft and corrected draft have, since we are, inwardly still ancient Jews and heathens with unholy gods. Text, with that you pile up a mountain of Calvary over all Europe. Footnote 232, the corrected draft has, we ourselves. So that would read, we ourselves pile up a mountain of Calvary over all Europe. Text, drink your fill of the bloody atrocities of the war. Feast upon the killing and destruction, then your eyes will open. You will see that you yourselves are the bearers of such fruit. Footnote 233, the corrected draft has, and we called ourselves Christians, imitators of Christ. To be Christ oneself is the true following of Christ. Text, I saw the peasant's boot, the sign of the horrors of the peasant war. Footnote 234, this may refer to the German Peasants' War Rebellion of 1525. Okay, still have 4 pages of footnotes to go here. Let's see. Text, it is an inner happening that is the way to the perfection of the mystery of Christ. Footnote 235. In 1918, in his preface to the second edition of The Psychology of the Unconscious Processes, Jung wrote, quote, the spectacle of this catastrophe threw man back on himself by making him feel his complete impotence. It turned him inward, and with everything rocking, he seeks something that guarantees him a hold Too many still seek outward, but still too few seek inward to their own selves, and still fewer ask themselves whether the ends of human society might not best be served if each man tries to abolish the old order in himself, and to practice in his own person and in his own inward state those precepts, those victories which he preaches at every street corner, instead of always expecting these things of his fellow man. Text: May the frightfulness become so great that it turn men's eyes inward, so that their will no longer seeks the self in others, but in themselves. Footnote 236. The draft has, if this doesn't happen, Christ will not be overcome, and the evil must become even greater. Therefore, my friend, I say this to you so that you can tell your friends, and that the word may spread among the people. Text: I saw a new God, a child, who subdued demons in his hand. Footnote 237, the draft continues, I saw that a new God had come to be out of Christ the Lord, a young Hercules. Text: You cannot learn this. It only develops in you. You cannot will this. It takes the will from your hand and wills itself. Will yourself. That leads to the way. Footnote 238. A long passage occurs here in the draft and corrected draft, a paraphrase of which follows. The God holds love in his right, forethinking, the idea substituted throughout, in his left. Okay, so the God holds love in his right, forethinking in his left. Love is on our favorable side, forethinking on the unfavorable. This should recommend love to you insofar as you are a part of this world, and especially if you are a thinker. The God possesses both. Their unity is God. The God develops through the uniting of both principles in you. You do not become God through this or become divine, but God becomes human. He becomes apparent in you and through you as a child. The divine will come to you as childlike or childish insofar as you are a developed man. The childish man has an old God, the old God who we know and whose death we have seen. If you are grown up, you can only become more childlike. You have youth before you and all the mysteries of what is to come. The childish has death before him, since he must first become grown up. You will become grown up insofar as you overcome the God of the ancients and of your childhood. You overcome him not through setting him aside, obeying the spirit of the time, zeitgeist. The spirit of this time sways between yes and no, like a drunkard, since he is the uncertainty of the present general consciousness. You, one throughout, can only overcome the old God through becoming him yourself and experiencing his suffering and dying yourself. You overcome him and become yourself as one who seeks himself and no longer imitates heroes. You free yourself when you free yourself from the old God and his model. When you have become the model, then you no longer need his. In that, the God held love and forethinking in the form of the serpent in his hands. It was shown to me that he had seized the human will. God unifies the opposition between love and the idea and holds it in his hands. Love and forethinking existed from eternity, but they were not willed. Everyone always wills the spirit of this time, which thinks and desires. He who wills the spirit of the depths will love and forethinking. He who wills the spirit of the depths wills love and forethinking. If you will both, you become God. If you do this, the God is born and seizes possession of the will of men and holds his will in his child's hands. The spirit of the depths appears in you as thoroughly childish. If you don't want the spirit of the depths, he is to you a torment. Willing leads to the way. Love and forethinking are in the world of the beyond, so long as you do not will them, and your willing lies between them like the serpent, keeps them separate. If you will both, the struggle breaks out in you between willing love and willing forethinking, recognition. You will see that you can't will both at the same time. In this need, the God will be born, as you have experienced in the Mysterium, and he will take the divided will in his hands, in the hands of a child, whose will is simple and beyond being split. What is this divine childish willing? You can't learn it through description. It can only become in you. Nor can you will it. You cannot learn to empathize it from what I say. You cannot learn to empathize it from what I say. It is unbelievable how men can falsify themselves and lie to themselves. Let this be a warning. What I say is my mystery and not yours, my way and not yours, since myself belongs to me and not to you. You should not learn my way, but your own. My way leads to me and not to you. Text, the spirit of the depths, footnote 239. Footnote 239. The corrected draft has the Great Spirit. And so he's making an equivalency between the spirit of the depths and the Great Spirit. Okay, I'm on the last two footnotes, but they are huge. I'm on page, let's see, I hope this video will keep going. I'm on page 206. The principles strip themselves of human form. Footnote 240. A long passage here in the corrected draft, a paraphrase of which follows. As you saw how proud and power filled men, and how beauty streamed out of the eyes of women when the war gripped the people, you knew that mankind was on the way. You knew that this war was not only adventure, criminal acts, and killing, but mystery of self-sacrifice. But the mystery of self-sacrifice, the great change throughout, spirit of the depths, has seized humanity and forced him through the war to self-sacrifice. Do not seek the guilt here and there. Guilt doesn't lie outside. It is the spirit of the depths who leads the people into the Mysterium, just as he led me. He leads the people to the river of blood, just as he led me. I experienced in the Mysterium what the people were forced to do in actuality, which happened outside on a large scale. I did not know it, but the Mysterium taught me how my willing laid itself at the feet of the crucified God. I experienced, wanted, Christ's self-sacrifice. The Mysterium of Christ completed itself in front of my eyes, my forethinking. The idea standing above me forced me to this, but I resisted. My highest desire, my lions, my hottest and strongest passion, I wanted to rise up against the mysterious will to self-sacrifice. So I was like a lion encircled by the serpent, an image of fate eternally renewing itself. Salome came to me from the right, the favorable side. Pleasure awakened in me. I experienced that my pleasure comes to me when I accomplish the self-sacrifice. I hear that Maria, the symbol of love, is also my mother of Christ, since love has also borne Christ. Love brings the self-sacrifice and love brings the self-sacrificer and self-sacrifice. Love is also the mother of my self-sacrifice, in that I hear and accept this. I experience that I become Christ, since I recognize that love makes me into Christ. But I still doubt, since it is nearly impossible for the thinker to differentiate himself from his thought and accept what happens in his thought is also something outside of himself. It is outside him in the inner world. I become Christ in the Mysterium. Rather, I see how I was made into Christ and yet am completely myself, so that I could still doubt when my pleasure told me that I was Christ. Salome. My pleasure said to me that I am Christ, because love, which is higher than pleasure, which however is still in me hidden in pleasure, had led me to self-sacrifice and made me into Christ. Pleasure came near to me, encircled me in rings, and forced me to experience the torment of Christ, and to spill my blood for the world. My willing, which earlier served the spirit of this time, zeitgeist, substituted throughout, went under the spirit of the depths, and just as it was previously determined by the spirit of the time, it is now determined by the spirit of the depths, by forethinking, idea substituted throughout, and pleasure. It determined me through the willing of self-sacrifice and to the spilling of blood, my life's essence. Mark that it is my bad pleasure which leads me to self-sacrifice. Its innermost is love, which will be freed from pleasure through sacrifice. Here the wonder happened that my previously blind pleasure became sighted. My pleasure was blind, and it was love. Since my strongest willing willed self-sacrifice, my pleasure changed. It went into a higher principle, which in God is one with forethinking. Love is sighted, but pleasure is blind. Pleasure always wants what is closest and feels through the multiplicity, going from one to another, without a goal, just seeking and never fulfilled. Love wants what is furthest, the best, and the fulfilling. And I saw something further, namely that the forethinking in me had the form of an old prophet, which showed that it was pre-Christian and transformed itself into a principle that no longer appeared in a human form, but in the absolute form of a pure white light. So the human relative transformed itself into the divine absolute through the mysterium of Christ. Forethinking and pleasure united in me in a new form, and the willing in me, which appeared foreign and dangerous. The willing of the spirit of the depths lay paralyzed at the feet of the shining flame. I became one with my will. This happened in me. I just saw it in the mystery play. Through this much was made known that I didn't previously know, like in a play, but I found everything doubtful. I felt as if he was melting in the air, since the land of the Mysterium, that spirit, was still foreign to me. The Mysterium showed me the things which lay before me and had to be fulfilled, but I did not know how and when. But that image of the sighted Salome, who knelt in rapture before the white flame, was a strong feeling that came to the side of my will and led me through everything that came after. What happened was my wandering with myself, through whose suffering I had to earn what served for the completion of the Mysterium I had first seen. And finally, this is the last paragraph of Liber Primus. The mystery showed me in images what I should afterward live. I did not possess any of those boons that the mystery showed me, for I still had to earn all of them. Footnote 241. Gilles Kispel reports that Jung told the Dutch poet Roland Horst that he had written psychological types on the basis of 30 pages of the Red Book, cited in Stephen Heller, The Gnostic Jung and the Seven Sermons of the Dead, Wheaton, Illinois, Quest, 1985. It is likely that he had in mind these preceding 3 chapters of the Mysterium. What is presented here develops the notions of the conflict between opposing functions, the identification with the leading function, and the development of the reconciling symbol as a resolution of the conflict of opposites, which are the central issues in Chapter 5 of Psychological Type, Collected Works 6, The Type Problem in Poetry. In his 1925 seminar, Jung said, "I found that the unconscious is working out enormous collective fantasies. Just as before, I was passionately interested in working out myths. Now I became just as much interested in the material of the unconscious. This is in fact the only way of getting at myth formation. And so the first chapter of the psychology of the unconscious became most correctly true. I watched the creation of myths going on and got an insight into the structure of the unconscious, forming thus the concept that plays such a role in the types. I drew all my empirical material from my patients, but the solution of the problem I drew from the inside, from my observations of the unconscious processes. I have tried to fuse these 2 currents of outer and inner experience in the book of the types, and have termed the process of the fusion of the 2 currents the transcendent function. Introduction to Jungian Psychology, page 35. And so ends the footnotes. Turned out to be a long bit. But anyway, those footnotes will make very little sense unless you go back and read and listen to the video I did yesterday on Mysterium Encounter, and also to Dr. Jung's commentary, which I read 2 days ago. So they should all be side by side in the channel, and I'm not sure where you should begin. I think Jungian psychology is such that you simply need to enter the forest and see where, and then try to figure out where you are. Now I'm going to go back and look at comments. Let's see. So I can't find where I left off in the chats. I think I'm going, since there are quite a number there, I think I'm going to leave the chats for this behind the scenes reading. And so they will be in the behind the scenes reading, but when I edit the video, assuming that I do, they won't appear. Okay, there's a message from Reptilionus that is held for review. Okay, and so it's his Gmail address, so I will show that, as that was his choice to show his Gmail account. Okay, and as he says at the end, there's too many comments, Skip, just skip it. I guess I have to, because YouTube normally limits me to 2 hours. I'm still cooking on my internal recording, but I'm not sure I'm still cooking on the recording that's going to go on YouTube. So I am now going to discontinue this reading. This has been a reading of Mysterium Encounter from the Red Book Liber Novus by C.G. Jung, and I've been reading the footnotes. And as you see, it took me more than 2 hours to read just the footnotes, but I think that they're extremely meaningful, and particularly the last ones, footnote 240 and especially 240, I think is particularly important for our current situation. So thank you for joining me today. I'm going to move on.